Tips with Tony. Tips with Tony. All about nutrition from your favorite dietitian. Everything you need to digest in your mind. Tips with Tony. Tips with Tony. Making you healthier one bite at a time. With Tony. Woo.
Hello and welcome to the Tips with Tony podcast. I'm Tony Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time. I'm very excited for you to hear this next interview. I have in front of me Taylor Arnold, who is a registered dietitian, and she is going to talk all about how to grow intuitive eaters. I absolutely love the name of her business, of where you can find her online. We'll talk more about that, at the end where you can find her. But without further ado, Taylor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tony. I'm excited to be here.
You're so welcome. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I know a lot of parents listen to this podcast, so I think they're going to appreciate it a lot. So the first question I always have my guests answer is to just introduce yourself by sharing who you are, what you do, and most importantly, why you do what you do.
Sure. So I'm Taylor. Like you said, I'm a dietitian, pediatric dietitian. I also have my PhD in nutrition. So I come from a background of nutrition research, and I help moms raise their kiddos to be intuitive eaters who eat a healthy, varied diet, lots of veggies, aren't obsessed with sweets, and ultimately help them reduce that risk for eating disorders later on down the road and help their kiddos establish lifelong healthy relationships with food. So it's awesome. I work with moms and kiddos alike on this stuff.
What made you get into that?
You know, I have always loved nutrition science, and I actually kind of fell into the behavior piece. I always thought I was going to do IV nutrition and nutrition in the hospitals and all like the super medical clinically stuff. And then I just started realizing how much teaching was required for that. And I ended up loving that piece of the nutrition component so much. And so I just decided to focus more on the teaching behavior side. And seeing the results that these families have just made me fall in love with this area of nutrition. So yeah.
I love that you work with both the parents and the children, because we know it's really difficult. And I know you probably work with all ages, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I recently had someone on the podcast who really spoke specifically to like newborns and toddlers. I would love if we could maybe focus this conversation more on, maybe teenagers or young adults, even like living in the same household. Because I think that is where, the sad thing is that I've heard people tell me that they've started their first diet at like 6 years old. So obviously the earlier we intervene, the better. However, at the same time, I feel like the eating disorder, which we're going to talk about in the prevention of, I feel like usually starts in like that early teen area. And obviously it hits everyone differently. I'm sure you could speak to that more, but I feel like that would be a really great opportunity for us to really kind of focus on like those age groups.
Yeah. I work with 0 to 18, and my course focuses more on 0 to 10, but setting up these habits early on is what helps set those habits in motion for teens, because it's really honestly a lot harder to work with a picky 16-year-old than it is to work with a picky 4-year-old as a parent.
That's probably very true. And also, I've worked with picky adults. Love you guys. You know who I'm talking to. Very picky eater clients that still don't eat vegetables.
Yeah.
We're working on it. But yeah, I think that makes sense. Like that saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Like the earlier you do it, the better. I agree with that.
They just have stronger and louder opinions as a teenager.
Yeah, that's probably very true too. That's very, very true. So before we even kind of jump into the how-tos and the what's and the whys and all of that, maybe you could just explain or define intuitive eating, because I know I've had people on this podcast before talk about it. I've talked about it before, but we had it on one podcast, but there's new listeners. So I think it would be nice for you to really just to define what intuitive eating actually is.
Sure. So intuitive eating is, I think it's a little more complex than it sounds, but it encompasses listening to your body's hunger and fullness cues, honoring the way that food makes you feel, and taking that into consideration. It also encompasses ignoring like the influences of diet culture that we get a lot, and focusing really on the way that you feel after you eat something and how it nourishes your body, including does it fill you up or not. And I think a lot of people hear intuitive eating and think, oh, just eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. And sure, listening to your hunger and fullness cues is a component of intuitive eating, but it goes so much deeper than that. Like recognizing the emotional and social components of food and how they factor into your desire to want to eat. And then when it comes to intuitive eating for kids, it's a little bit different than adults, because as adults, we want to have food accessible to them at all times to help reduce the risk for like binging. But with a 3-year-old, if you have like a chocolate cake sitting out and say you can eat it whenever you want, that doesn't always work. So we have to bring in some other components of something called the division of responsibility when it comes to feeding kids and raising them to be intuitive eaters.
You called it the division of responsibility?
Yes.
Do you want to maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So the division of responsibility in feeding was a term coined by a really well-known dietitian. Her name is Ellen Satter. She's wonderful. And basically the principle is you provide, child decides. So it's the parent's responsibility to provide the food, decide when the food is served and what is served. And it's the child's responsibility to decide what to eat of that food and how much they want to eat. So it very clearly delineates mealtime responsibilities, and adhering to that and working with a pediatric dietitian to apply that in your house really, really helps to reduce like power struggles at meal times that we see a lot with kids.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay. So I guess the first question I really have for you to really dive deeper into this is, I'm sure you've met with a lot of different parents and you've seen a lot of kids. Have you noticed are there like certain common, maybe like 3, the most like common mistakes that parents are making when it comes to raising intuitive eaters?
Yes. It's funny that you say that, because I was just working on writing up some mistakes that I see parents make a lot. But I think one of the big mistakes, and it's something that parents not only do, but then they feel guilty about doing or feel guilty about even thinking about doing, is hyper focusing on their kids' weight. Because like I see a lot of parents come to me and say, well, I don't want my kid to be fat, but I know I'm not supposed to think about that and focus on their weight. So now I feel bad about that too. And so it's definitely like an interesting position for parents to be in, because maybe they have experienced situations where they felt uncomfortable because of their weight and they don't want their kids to feel the same way. But by focusing and trying to prevent that, you ultimately can cause issues with weight down the road.
Yeah. I mean, I think back to when I would go to the doctor and I was always on the higher percentile, and my parents never made me feel, I'll say in the doctor's office, like I never was really made to feel bad about it, but the doctor and the nurse, even though their intention was well, it was just the tone and the way, and I still interpreted it as like, oh, I'm fat, I'm big, right. And it's like, so how do you handle that? Because I feel like if we're not focused on it, but like what happens now if a child really is overweight and they really, maybe it is advised that, I know you're not supposed to make a child lose weight, but maybe you need to share that and say why. But like, kind of like, what do you do now if you do have someone who really is either underweight or overweight? And it's kind of like, we don't want to make weight the focus, but at the same time, for their health, maybe, especially like in the more extreme cases, like maybe it kind of, it almost needs to be part of the focus. Do you hear what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. So I think part of the core of the issue is that we have a lot of medical providers who are not informed on this topic. Yeah. So like old timey, ideas was like, if you were above this certain percentile in the growth chart or you were below this certain percentile of the growth chart, like that is bad, period. But we really need to like look at the whole picture. But I see a lot of parents come to me who, and I have phenomenal pediatricians out there, so I don't want to like bang on pediatricians, but I do have a lot of parents come to me who say, my pediatrician said that my child is overweight, just from like one point on the growth chart, but we're not taking into account like, Is the child going through a growth spurt early? Are they following their trend? And maybe they're like really athletic and they're just have a muscular build. Maybe their parents are like 6'1" and 6'6", those all play into the child's growth, and we need to look at all of those components too. So I think that that's a big piece is finding a provider who's well informed on growth. And so I do tell my parents that, or my parents of my kiddos, that if you have a doctor who makes you feel uncomfortable with the way that they're approaching your child's weight, it's okay to find a new provider who's more informed on that. So I think that's really important to know, that for parents to know that. And then really ultimately removing restriction is going to be important when it comes to your child's weight. So for example, if you start to see that your child is gaining weight, a lot of parents will restrict their serving sizes or not give seconds at meal times or not serve desserts. And all of those things are going to create behaviors that either make the child feel bad about themselves and start to connect emotions with food, which is something we don't want, or make dessert seem to be like this elusive, exciting thing that then they become obsessed with and want more and more and more constantly. So it's very counterintuitive with how we want to approach weight in kiddos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So would you consider restricting your kids be like mistake number 2? Or what would be another mistake that parents might make if they're trying to raise intuitive eaters?
Another mistake that they would make would probably be, restriction. Restriction in the form of mistakes that their parents have made. So things like the Clean Plate Club is a form of restricting your child's control over a mealtime. And then not serving dessert would be another form of restriction. So there's a lot of ways we can restrict a child around food. But yeah, let's talk about restricting dessert, for example. I would definitely consider a mistake, because you're going to create this elusive, exciting thing. And then when they go to a birthday party, they're going to have 10 cups because they never seen it before, or they never get it at home. So that would definitely be something that I would consider a mistake, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, so, going off of that, I work with a lot of women who struggle with disordered eating or have a history of an eating disorder, or presently it's kind of come back up. And we kind of have to make the decision if leaving certain foods in the house, which could be their trigger foods, is at some point it's helpful and at some point it's not helpful to leave those foods in the home. But they also tend to also be parents. And so how do you kind of draw the line of helping yourself while also helping your kids? And so raising an intuitive eater, but you're struggling with learning how to be an intuitive eater yourself.
Right. So it's kind of like the mask on an airplane. You need to help yourself before you can really teach your kids these behaviors. So if it's a struggle for mom to have a chocolate cake in the house, let's say that's a trigger for her and she has binge eating disorder, then don't have the cake in the house, because that's going to be really emotionally hard for you. You're going to have, you're going to have less from your cup to fill your child's cup, and it's just going to be harder to work on their eating behaviors, and maybe even working on their eating behaviors is going to become a trigger for you. So really, I want moms to work on themselves and those behaviors first, and then letting your kids see that journey that you're going through. I think is also really, really important, because it teaches them, you're not perfect and nobody's perfect, and nutrition is really important to me, and we're going to work on this, but we're going to do it in a healthy way. And this is the healthy boundary that I need to set for myself. So
that's powerful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
One more mistake. Any other mistake you see parents make?
Yeah. So I would say trying to be too controlling at meal times, because you're worried about the amount of veggies that they eat, for example. Because the more pressure we put on your kid at meal times can really backfire and cause the power struggles and cause them to not want to eat their veggies. So to bring it back to the division of responsibility, again, it's your job to provide the food and their job to decide. So if you say, you need to eat one more bite of veggie before you get down from the table, or you need to have a bite of broccoli before you have your cake, you're taking away their ability to decide if they want to eat that. And we've then broken those boundaries that you set. We've broken kind of a mutual understanding or trust at the dinner table. And then that can be really challenging to repair. So putting that pressure on kids can be difficult. And it's just like the restriction, it's super counterintuitive, because you hear like broccoli, it's good for calcium, it's got fiber, it's really good for my kid, they need to eat it. But then you put it on their plate and they don't eat it, then what do you do?
Right.
Like, do I force them to eat it? Or do I just let them not eat it? And my response for most kids, I mean, obviously there's some exceptions, but for almost all kids, it's no, we don't want to have them take one bite, because you're breaking down that trust that you have at the meal times. And they're going to be less likely to choose to eat that in the future. So what we want is we want to encourage their curiosity and their choice to choose to eat the broccoli, not force them to eat the broccoli.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how would you do that if you're not going to tell them to eat it? Like, so how could you encourage them, even though we're not trying to tell them to eat it? How would you encourage them
to eat it? That's a really complicated question.
We want them to.
Yeah. So I mean, we definitely want them to eat the broccoli, and we want them to eat their veggies. That's really important. As a dietitian, I don't ever discount the value that veggies can bring to a child's health. But that, I mean, it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of different strategies as a dietitian that I use with my families. And so, like, for example, one would be modeling. Make sure you're eating the broccoli too, because if you set the broccoli down in front of your kid and you don't even touch it, well, what are they going to think? Mm-hmm. You know, of course they're not. Isn't it?
I have to just say this because I know that I'm not the only one. So my boyfriend has a 4-year-old daughter, and it's funny because I work with a lot of moms, so I always hear about this, but now I really experience it firsthand. Like, we could all sit down, we could all make our meals. I'll make, because I eat, I do eat pretty healthy, so I'll usually add something. So I'm not not eating what they're eating. I just add a veggie or whatever. And never fails. She's always like, what do you want? What are you eating? I want that. I want that. Right. No matter what it is. And I'm like, okay, you can try. Yeah. But it never fails. Or sometimes she already ate and I'm having a snack, and she always, it's really so true. You cannot eat in peace with these kids.
Oh my gosh, so true. Yeah.
So I hear you. So modeling behavior, and if they see it, they'll probably want it more.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And I hear a lot of moms will ask me okay, well, I'm a picky eater and I hate broccoli. So now what am I going to do? Because I don't want my kid to be like that too. And you don't need to eat the broccoli, but you need to put it on your plate. Ideally, you should try a bite. You don't have to, though. I mean, we're not going to force again. But even if you don't eat it, let's talk about it. Maybe you can smell it. Maybe, you can lick the broccoli. We need to have some interaction with the food to show the child that it's not scary and it's something that you're willing to try too, to model that to the child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super helpful. So, I mean, I was going to think about school stuff, but I don't know if people are really even going to school. Because my question was going to be what happens now? You pack your kid these healthy meals, and now you find out that they've been throwing them out and either not eating them or going to the vending machine or eating that. And I don't know, I guess, how do you handle when kids are the older, right? So teenagers, where you might make them this lunch and then you find out that they didn't eat it.
Right. So, I mean, with teens, again, they're starting to become autonomous, and we want them to be making these good choices for themselves, especially if they're planning on going to college and they're going to be in the dorm rooms where they're having all sorts of food available to them. So usually the school lunches are the last meal that we work on when I work with a family, because you're not there.
Right.
And so you can do the you provide, child decides thing. But if they have a job and they have money and they want to spend it on the vending machine, I guess there's only so much you can do about it as a parent, right? You can't follow them to school and hold your hand over the coin cover on the vending machine so they can't get their cookie or whatever. So it's what it comes down to is establishing those healthy habits at home for breakfast, snacks, and lunches. And then that will hopefully empower them to make those healthy choices at lunchtime. Mm-hmm. And, teens definitely are not too young to start learning about the science of nutrition and how food affects your body, and really talking to them about those things and the importance of vitamins and minerals. But again, it's really most important to start establishing those healthy habits at home, and then hopefully that will translate. But also, if you're really concerned and they don't have a job, don't send them with money. Send them with a lunch, and that's the lunch they get. And if they don't want to eat it, fine. They can wait till they get home, and then you can provide them with a healthy snack. Right. So it's, yeah.
Yeah. So I agree. So I think there's usually, I'm assuming people who are listening have like two scenarios, right? So you have the kid who's either a picky eater or doesn't eat well or doesn't eat healthy, or potentially in your eyes, in the parents' eyes, they're either overeating or eating too much of like sweets or whatever. But then we probably have parents who notice maybe their teens are intentionally skipping meals. And restricting. I mean, I know that's what started for me when I was 14. That's when it really started, where I would just have an orange for the whole day, right? And it was like, to be honest, I don't know if it was ever noticed. That's the saddest part. I don't know if I did a good job hiding it. It's not their responsibility to know, but I do wonder, like, when do we intervene, or, what do you do if you notice that a child is restricting their intake intentionally? So now you didn't create this. It's just maybe they heard of a friend doing a diet, or maybe, they were teased about being overweight or something like that, about their body. And so now they're starting to restrict their intake. What would you say, or what does a parent do in that situation?
So, first of all, that's a really tough situation. And I would want moms to know that they're not alone. There's a lot of moms who are experiencing the same thing. And I want moms to know that's not their fault. Like, even if the behaviors that they're doing at home are contributing to this in their child, a lot of times these behaviors are ingrained into us, like, from our childhood. It's all we know. So if you notice your child going through restriction, I would 100% get them on board with a pediatric dietitian. I think at that point, it's very, very important to start working with a professional. It may also warrant working with a therapist as well, depending on the reason behind it. Like, if we're working with restriction because of, body image issues or any mental health crises or anything like that, we definitely want to have a good team on board. But what can you do at home, right? Because you still want stuff to be able to do, like, right away at home. So importantly, you'll want to examine the way that you're approaching food and bodies in your house. So oftentimes I see parents who have children who are restricting. Mom and dad are doing that too. Or a lot of times they're learning that behavior in the home. So we'll want to work on that behavior, the way we talk about our bodies. So body positive talk. Sometimes I even assign families to, like, let's say 2 positive things about our bodies that we're thankful for that have nothing to do with our weight. So for example, like, I'm a cross country runner and I'm really thankful for my legs because I just freaking love to run. Right. And so it sounds cheesy and corny, and you're going to probably have a hard time getting a 16-year-old to, like, do that. But it really shows the lesson that we don't focus on our weight. You definitely still want to implement. So there's a fine line, right, between when we implement the division of responsibility and when we now have to implement, like, an eating disorder protocol. And if that is the case, if we're in the eating disorder protocol world, then you definitely, again, need to be working with a dietitian who will monitor the child's intake and monitor their eating behaviors. But if we're still on this line of, like, you notice just some, like, I don't eat the chocolate cake anymore because I don't like and you see your daughter looking at her legs funny in the mirror, like we're starting these behaviors. We want to model this body positivity. We want to model the non-restriction around food. And then we want to talk to our children about how their bodies change, because this is like really shocking for some teenagers. And then we can model these healthy behaviors for them and talk to them about it. So there's a fine line between like when your child is starting to show some concerning behaviors and we're looking at this more from a preventative perspective versus like what you said, eating one orange a day, or we're like heading into eating disorder territory. So when we're in that, like if a mom came to me and, for example, said that their daughter is eating an orange a day sometimes, that would be very concerning to me. And I would never want a mom or a parent to feel like they needed to handle that on their own at home, or they should. So I think that there's a stigma, right? There's a stigma against mental health. And there's a thought that like, oh, I should be working on my kid's healthy relationship with food, which you certainly should be. But once your child is having an eating disorder, or they're having very concerning behaviors, that's not something that you should ever feel like you need to do on your own. And there are certainly things you can do at home, but I just kind of really want to make that distinction, because I think that there's, even with the new movement of intuitive eating, there's a lot of pressure on moms to make sure we're like feeding our kids a certain way. And especially if like the wrong behaviors, I put that in air quotes if you're on the podcast, that they should do something about it. And it's really important to get a professional involved, because that's a very tricky situation.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah. So last question before we kind of wrap up, something I was just thinking about, what if you have, and I'm just going to share like an experience that came to mind. So you have a mom who is really doing the absolute best that she can to maybe develop healthier eating habits with their child. Maybe they're not saying that, I can't explain it, but I guess what I'm saying is you have like one parent who's really trying their absolute best to really be that positive role model and really kind of try to set the just model good behavior, right? And then you have another parent who maybe is just like not on board, like just like not, doesn't understand. Like, I know there's some men who really just feel like, what's an eat, like, well, okay, just eat your food and shut up. Like, kind of like, now it sounds obnoxious, but like, they don't really understand, I don't think, how serious like people are and critical about their bodies, and how like eating disorders are like a real thing. So like, how do you handle that? How do you handle having like one parent who really is trying their absolute best to make it work, but then you have the other parent who's kind of like doing the opposite?
Right. And I just want to clarify before I answer that question is, I do sometimes see the moms being the ones putting in a lot of the work, but sometimes dads are too. And sometimes the mom is the picky one. So, but anyways, that can be really challenging. And I don't have an easy answer. Like, I can't give you like a one thing, you should just do this, because the true answer is that parent, you need to have a sit down with whatever parent is not willing to put in the work and talk to them about how influential their eating behaviors are on their children. So let's say you have one extreme, right? Like maybe one parent is doing very restrictive dieting, talking about how they don't want to be fat, cutting calories, not eating meals, being very critical of their body and saying certain foods are very bad for you, that sort of thing. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then another end of the spectrum is like you have a parent who doesn't eat any vegetables, never models any vegetables, only eats food like cakes and chips and fast food. Both of those things are problematic, and both you need to work on both of those behaviors with your partner. And that is hard, right? Because how do you go to your partner and be like, hey, this is like something that you need to fix? Like, what partner ever responds well to that? No. So I usually recommend that parent get involved with adult dietitian like yourself, Tony, or, somebody else to work on those behaviors before we can really see the huge changes with the kids. That's not to say we can't see changes with kids if a parent is having some not so great eating behaviors, because we can, but you have to recognize that without working on that parent's behavior, the progress is going to be much slower for your child. And sometimes that parent is not willing to work on their behaviors, or like maybe you have a divorced couple, for example, and like you can't have a lecture to the baby's dad because he doesn't want to talk to you about it. You just have to do your best to implement these strategies when you're in charge of mealtime, and recognize that like your child is going to learn that sometimes rules are different in other places, and that's just the way it is. So you just have to do your best and try to get that other person to work on themselves and get some help if they need it.
Yeah, that's really true. Yeah, I can think of a lot of different scenarios like that, particularly with divorced couples, and like maybe the stepmom is the one that isn't modeling the best behavior, or she is, or there's like there can always be like that one person that tends to kind of it feels like it's counterproductive of what you're doing, but what you're saying is that just keep doing what you're doing. It is making a difference. You are doing the best that you can, and that's really all that matters.
Right. And if you are working with a pediatric dietitian, the nice thing about that is, like, for example, I can send instructions to both households. So that can be a little bit helpful too, if you want somebody neutral to say why things are important and why certain behaviors are important. So I see that also being helpful if you need like a neutral third party can be.
Yeah, no, that's definitely helpful. And I think also too, I've had parents come to me, and I don't work with people under the age of 18, but I have had parents come to me and have asked me to speak with their children because they feel like they're going to listen to, me versus them. And like, that's also super helpful.
Yes, I get that all the time.
Yeah, so definitely.
Yes.
That's great. Awesome. Well, this has been amazing. Before we let people know where they can find you, is there any kind of last minute topics, tips, comments that you wanted to go over?
Yeah, I just want to say that intuitive eating is becoming sort of a buzzword on social media, and all these behaviors that we should be teaching our kids. Again, that's in air quotes, the should. And you should give yourself a pat on the back, moms who are listening to this, and dads too, for doing your best with your kids. And know that if, you're struggling with eating behaviors, or maybe you see something concerning popping up with your child, that it's not your fault. And there is a lot of things that you can do to help them. And that you really do have a say in the way that we raise our kids to eat and what sort of eating styles that they have. But I want to take off like the mom guilt of things, because a lot of times, the things that happen with our kids' behaviors or their health you can't do anything about it. And so that's why I always recommend working with a professional. But I just want to get rid of the mom guilt, because it doesn't help anybody.
Or guilt, food guilt in general too.
Yes. We don't need any of that. It's not helpful.
Guilt and
it's not
shame. We need
anything.
to just get them away.
Right. You are feeding your kids the best way you know how to do. And that is amazing. And you should be giving yourself a pat on the back for that.
Totally. And it's hard. I don't know, because I'm not a mom, but I can only imagine how difficult it is from what I see. And the part-time experience that I have with my boyfriend's daughter, who's just a doll, who's easy. So for me, it's like I don't even feel like I really have the experience, because she's literally a doll. Like, so for me at least, not for her parents. But isn't that always the case? They're just
I see that a lot.
But anyways, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on. Please let the listeners know where they can find you, work with you, contact you, etc.
Yes. So I'm very active on Instagram. It's at growing.intuitive.eaters. So you can send me a DM there. And then I also have a course for parents who want to grow intuitive eaters, teach their kids how to eat intuitively, teach them to have healthy relationship with food, not be obsessed with desserts, and eat more veggies. And you can find a webinar talking about my methods and some mistakes that parents make at growingintuitiveeaters.com/learn. So
that I'm going to send that to one of my clients for sure. She's going to really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So is it for the parents to watch, or is it for parents to watch with their kids?
It's for the parents to watch. So the webinar talks about the 3 mistakes that parents make, and it also talks about my methods that I use in my course. So it's like a little bit less than an hour. But ultimately, if a parent wants to make these big changes with their kiddos, then they definitely belong inside my Growing Intuitive Eaters 101 course.
Awesome. Perfect. I'll put that in the show notes for sure.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being here, guys. Please give her a follow on Instagram. If you enjoyed this podcast, please take a screenshot of it, share it on your story, tag me, tag Taylor, and thank you for coming on, Taylor. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening. If you're not already subscribed to the podcast, please hit that subscribe button. It allows other people to find the podcast, but more importantly, it notifies you when a new episode comes out every Monday and every Wednesday. As always, I'm Toni Marinucci, your registered dietitian, helping you get healthy one bite at a time.